Greetings, everyone. I am so glad that you all have each other because there is nothing like a personal story to uh, to really bring home the reality of a social issue. Um, in this case, you were very generous in sharing your stories about racial profiling in this week's discussion. Um, some of you were surprised that racial profiling exists. Some of you described not having experienced it. Some of you described having lived through continuous experiences of racial profiling, some of which were very terrifying and left lasting impressions. Some of you described the fear that you experience raising kids who could be profiled. When you think about it, it's very interesting that we live in such different realities. And I'm so glad that you have each other to educate you about what some of those different realities are. Let's think first of all in terms of Tim Wise's definitions of racial profiling. I'm going to read from his ideas here. He says, racial profiling means one of two things. First, the over-application of an incident-specific criminal description in a way that results in the stopping, searching, and harassment of people based on skin color. So Diane's story is a very disturbing example of this. Wise says the second and more common form of racial profiling is the disproportionate stopping, searching, frisking, and harassment of people of color in the hopes of uncovering a crime, even when there is no crime already in evidence for which a particular description might be available. And several of you described experiences of being stopped by police, being followed in stores, being harassed in various ways. Wise says, the bottom line is that racial profiling doesn't happen because data justifies the practice, but rather because those with power are able to get away with it and find it functional to do so as a mechanism of social control over those who are less powerful. By typifying certain, quote, others as dangerous or undesirable, those seeking to maintain divisions between people whose economic and social interests are actually quite similar can successfully maintain those cleavages. I'm going to read that last part again. The bottom line is that racial profiling doesn't happen because data justifies the practice, but rather because those with power are able to get away with it and find it functional to do so as a mechanism of social control over those who are less powerful. By typifying certain, quote, others as dangerous or undesirable, those seeking to maintain divisions between people whose economic and social interests are actually quite similar, can successfully maintain these cleavages. So, in our societal context, those who are in power benefit from dividing and condemning people based on difference. And as you discussed so well, the impact of that is destructive to the society as a whole, and it is destructive to everyone who is a target, and it is particularly destructive to adolescents, children of all ages actually, but in this case adolescents who are in the midst of identity formation, including ethnic and racial identity formation. As I read your posts, I was thinking that you could very well be discussing bullying just as well as racial profiling, because racial profiling is actually bullying, just on a larger social scale. And when you think about the negative consequences of bullying that we've been learning about, imagine how much deeper those consequences are when you're living in a society that's hostile to you and views you as dangerous and therefore justifies authority figures harassing you. It can be very hurtful and confusing to adolescents as they're in the process of identity formation. And as you pointed out in the piece, Ethnic and Racial Identity Formation, the encounter stage involves either a negative or a positive experience that has to do with race. If the experience is negative, for example, as in racial profiling or race-based violence, this will significantly impact the racial identity development of the person, setting a tone for the way they think about their own race and the race of others. If the water is poison and you drink the water, it's very difficult to avoid getting sick. Several of you discussed the consequences of racial profiling. For example, what we read related to the loss of educational opportunity, and children performing as authority figures, particularly teachers, expect them to perform. Children are very vulnerable to this risk factor unless it is offset by confidence and high expectations of them expressed by other authority figures. You also mentioned research indicating a higher incidence of antisocial behaviors among kids who have been racially profiled. And I'm submitting to you the idea that why should you take seriously and protect social norms in a society that is hostile toward you? It doesn't make sense. What does make sense is that you would develop strategies for resisting that defamation of your own character and potential. And so antisocial behaviors in that light, in the light of resistance, makes sense in a way as a coping strategy. Something that was very striking to me in your discussion was the vast difference in lived experience between you. And as Diane pointed out, it is nearly impossible for people who have not experienced being racially profiled to really understand the short and long-term effects that it has on an individual or a group of people. You also mentioned the difficulty that people who have not been profiled, the difficulty that people have in understanding what it feels like to have to teach your children how to stay safe around authority figures. It reminds me of a story that I heard from a Black family therapist who said she came home from a long day working with clients to find her 9-year-old son, who was nearly 6 feet tall, playing hide and seek with his friends. And she had to call the boys inside and sit them down and explain to them that playing hide and seek in the bushes in this society could be lethal when you're old enough to appear to be a man. Whether or not you have had an experience of being racially profiled, all of us have had the experience of being targeted at one time or another. And so the critical thing here is that each of us find a way to identify something in our own experience that provides us with a personal reference to use to empathize with people who are targeted. It's very important to find within ourselves some link that will allow us to build a bridge of empathy. So those are my reflections on our conversation this week. And once again, I want you to know how much I appreciate your generosity of spirit in sharing your stories and in hearing and validating and affirming one another's stories. You did a great job of adding to the conversation rather than repeating things that had already been said. And you also did an excellent job of linking the readings and the videos with your own thoughts and comments in the discussion. So that was a very rich discussion, and I look forward to next week.